Hi guys, welcome to the Headphone Show. For today's video, we have a review for you of the 64 Audio TIA Fourte. As the name suggests, this is a 4-driver IEM with 3 balanced armatures and 1 dynamic driver. 2 of those balanced armature drivers are their TIA driver, which we will talk about. And this is a flagship IEM that comes in at around $3,600. So this is a crazy, top-of-the-line, ridiculously expensive IEM. So let's take a look. If you watched this before, you know the drill. We'll go through the build quality, design, and comfort. We'll talk about the technical performance, so that's detail retrieval, speed and dynamics, stage and imaging, and timbre. And then we'll go through the tonality a little bit and talk about the frequency response, and then do some comparisons. But I just want to mention one thing off the bat, and it's that 64 Audio, at least from my experience, are very meticulous about their frequency response and tonality. When you hear a 64 Audio IEM, you can tell that they care a lot about getting the tuning right. So it's not just about cramming the most technology possible into a shell and then ending up with a tuning that doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it still has crazy technical performance. I've come across other IEMs in the past that are like that, where it's like, oh, this would sound great if the tuning was good. But with 64 Audio, there's a much more calculated approach to this. And so with Fourte, the flagship, that's one of the things that I'm trying to be conscious of. Do they continue to follow the meticulous and calculated approach to frequency response and tonality? Because at $3,600, you would expect that the technical performance here would be nuts. But let's get started with build quality, design, and comfort. This is the same as the rest of their universal IEMs that I've evaluated, so the U12T and the TIA Trio. The shell and the housing looks very similar, with the exception of this is sort of an orange brass colored design with a different kind of more flashy faceplate there as well. But it does use sort of this 2-piece system here. I gotta say, I like the design, I like what they did with the other ones, and I like it here as well. And they are comfortable to wear. Not the most comfortable, but they are up there. They are consistently very comfortable to wear. I don't have any problems with this. I gotta mention though with the cable that this is not the best cable that I've ever used. It's generally fine. I don't have a ton of problems with it, but it's not the most tangle-free. These days, there's certainly other cables out there that you could get that are a little bit more premium feeling than this one, but you know, for the most part, this is not a problem. They do come with a number of tips in the box, and they come with a carrying case, which I'm not a huge fan of the carrying case because I would like something that's a little bit more portable. This is a little bit large. So I do get that the whole point of this case is to be protective more than anything else. I just wish that it was a little bit more manageable. All right, so let's talk about technical performance. And for detail retrieval, yeah, this is nuts. This is pretty much what I would expect. You know, when I was evaluating the TIA Trio and comparing it with the Empire Ears Legend X, I found that the Legend X actually outperformed the TIA Trio for technical performance, so for detail and for stage and all that stuff, even though I ended up preferring the TIA Trio overall for its tonality. And with the Fourte, it's made up all of that ground and then potentially more. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that the detail retrieval here, the detail retrieval benefits are most noticed in the treble and in the mid-range, and that may have something to do with the TIA drivers that are being used. And with the TIA drivers, they use what's called their tubeless design, and that means that there's nothing impeding the actual sound frequencies being produced. And so they have one for the highs and they have one for the mids. And that will also show up a little bit later when we talk about tonality as well. But at the moment, yes, it is still obvious that there was more to gain when it comes to the technical performance and detail retrieval for IEMs over the standard multi-balanced armature systems that are out there, right? There's a lot more going on here for detail retrieval than I would be used to with something like the Zeus 14, or honestly, even the U12T, which I think is fantastic at detail retrieval as well. So in my mind, this is possibly the most detail capable IEM that I've ever heard. And if I had to compare it with the Legend X, I may give the edge to the TIA Fourte. For speed and dynamics, this is also what you would expect with high-performance multi-balanced armature IEMs. It's very tight and it's very clear and distinct. And then it also has the dynamic driver handling bass frequencies, so it does slam and punch hard. It slams better than the U12T, but because it's a dynamic driver there, it also doesn't feel quite as tight. So I think that's a trade-off. And in my mind, that's a trade-off that most people would probably be willing to make. It's the same thing with the TIA Trio, where they added a dynamic driver to the bass, and that trade-off exists there as well, where your bass tones are not as clean and tight because there is extra excursive capability, there's extra slam going on there. And I think most people, myself included, would enjoy that. For soundstage and imaging, that is the category where the TIA Fourte takes the biggest step forward over the TIA Trio. you get a really nice spacious presentation here. And it is aided by the tonality as well, which we will talk about. But I think a lot of this is just in the design as well. It's just a much more spacious presentation, very similar to what was going on with the Legend X, and potentially even more spacious than that one. That's the first thing you notice when you try out the Tia Fourte, or when you go from the Tia Trio to the Tia Fourte, is, oh, now there's stuff going on everywhere. It's a very much kind of all around you experience, whereas the Trio is a little bit more focused inwards. Not bad, just not as spacious as what's going on with the Fourte or the Legend X as well. I always find that with IEM, soundstage is like the biggest challenge to kind of figure out, because I mean, you really can only do so much with the space that you have here. And so apart from, doing frequency response related tricks, you're not really going to be able to enhance a sense of stage all that much. You can't move the drivers further away from the ear. For timbre, that is also something where I think the Tia Fourte is a clear step up from the U12T. Now, I didn't find the U12T's timbre to be all that bad. There are other multi-balanced armature IEMs where the timbre is so off that it obscures detail. I've come across this multiple times now. But with the U12T, it wasn't that bad, but you could still notice it if you specifically paid attention. I think with the Tia Trio, you could also notice it as well. And I'd always just assume that was the trade-off that you had to make if you wanted to get a multi-balanced armature IEM, is you had to deal with that sort of metallic smearing or straining effect. The Tia Fourte doesn't have it, at least as far as I can tell. It doesn't intrude anywhere. It's not annoying. So it might be because they've added an extra Tia driver there for the mids, so that each balanced armature driver isn't being asked to do too much. In any case, the timbre here is definitely excellent. It doesn't sound metallic or strained at all, and it certainly doesn't obscure any of the details, so we're good there. Okay, so let's talk about tonality and frequency response, because the Tia Fourte is weird in that regard. And I began this review by talking about how meticulous and calculated 64 Audio have been in my experience with how they tune their IEMs. And I think they are being just as calculated with this one as well. Now, the reason why I say that is because this goes for a very specific tuning that, to me, sounds like a very specific room. A musician might hear this and go, oh, that sounds like that sounds like a stage that I'm used to playing on, something like that. Or that sounds like a room that I've played in the past. So there's lots of bass presence and lots of treble presence, and that sounds great and a lot of fun. But then in the mids, it's not like the whole mid-range is just withdrawn. It's just the top half of the mid-range is a little bit pulled down. So, up to 4.5 kHz, and then above that it kind of rises up again. And I do find though as well that the area at around 6K, 7K is a little bit elevated with this as well. Maybe a little bit too much for certain genres, and it reminds me a little bit of the Hi-Fi Man aria in that sense. But again, whether or not that's bothersome to you will really depend on the recording that you're listening to, and often the types of instruments that are being played and how they sound at those frequency ranges. But there's nothing out of balance as far as tonality goes, and that's why, once again, I think that 64 Audio have been very calculated with this tuning. Because if you look at one of the areas where it is withdrawn, sort of in that upper mid-range area, like anywhere around 3.5 kHz, a recession in that range also has the effect of enhancing the sense of space and stage. And so once again, here we have something that is a little bit unconventional in its tonality, but at the same time highlights the stage characteristics, highlights the sense of space that this IEM has. But then beyond that, it doesn't really have any major flaws or problem areas either. I have to say it's a bit of an acquired taste for its tonality, but I can absolutely see why somebody would want to acquire it. All right, let's compare it to a few others. Of course, the Tia Trio and the U12T, as well as the Legend X. The Fourte compared to the Tia Trio. The Tia Trio has a more, let's say, conventional V shape to it for its tonality, but the Fourte does much better at space and stage. And I also think that the detail retrieval is just a little bit better on the Fourte in the mid-range. And then for the U12T, that's my preferred tonality overall. It's the more, let's say, classically audiophile tonality, even though, yes, I'm aware they do make those for musicians. If you're looking for something that's like a turbo U12T, that is not this IEM, you'd be disappointed, because this doesn't sound like a U12T. It does better as far as its technical aspects goes, but not as linear for its tonality, not quite as, let's say, classically audiophile. When you hear this, you do realize that there aren't any flaws, there aren't any issues with the tonality. It's just not the one that you might be used to if you're used to U12T. And personally, I do prefer the tonality of the U12T. And so for me, the tonality with the Tia Forte is a little bit disappointing, even though I still think it's just as calculated as the rest of their line is. So this doesn't change my mind about that. It just gives you something that is a different flavor from the ones that we might be used to, and in my opinion, the one that I prefer. And of course, I have to also compare this to the Empire Ears Legend X, which I think technically they're very close. I think the Fourte might do a little bit better on the technical front, but not quite as much slam in the bass. Remember that the Empire Ears Legend X uses the 2 dynamic drivers to handle bass frequencies, the 2 W9 subwoofers. And so if you really are into bass, that is the IEM to go for. There's no question about it. But in my mind, the Fourte is far more balanced overall for its overall tonality than the Legend X. And so in my opinion, I would absolutely go with the Tia Forte. And it also retains the space and stage characteristics that the Legend X has, which remember did beat the Tia Trio. So if you've heard the Tia Trio and you've heard the Legend X and you go, I really wish that I had something that was kind of a combination of the two that performed as well as the Legend X, but had a more balanced tonality, well, then the Tia Forte is something to consider. Still not quite the same as the Tia Trio for its tonality, but it's a lot more balanced overall, right? Bass, mids, and treble. Doesn't have the crazy bass elevation that the Legend X does. And then of course, if you are a bass head and you really are into getting the most for bass, yeah, you can't really go wrong with the Legend X there. The Legend X is the one that, for anybody who is into bass, I will always recommend. But of course, that's not to say that there isn't extra bass here either. This is a solid performer for bass. And so maybe if you're a moderate bass head or a mild bass head, or you appreciate that guilty pleasure a little bit, then this might still satisfy that. So, do I recommend the 64 Audio Tia Forte? Well, I'm going to give a cautious recommendation here if, of course, you have ridiculous amounts of money to spend on a flagship IEM, because nothing that I've heard so far does detail and space and stage and all these qualities quite the same way that the Tia Forte does. And then on top of it, if you're looking for a very specific type of sound, like if you're maybe a musician and you want something to sound like a specific room or a particular stage that you may have played on or may play on, then there's a reason to pay attention to something like this or consider it, look into it. If you're looking for that more classical audiophile tuning, that more kind of linear sound, then stick with the U12T. For me, I do prefer the U12T. I think that's what I would still go for, either that or the Tia Trio. But I can absolutely understand why somebody would want this, because the technical benefits that you do get here, I think, are worth the upgrade. I don't know if they're worth the money that you'd have to spend to go from a Tia Trio up to something like this, because it's a lot more expensive. But it is still worth noting that, you know, if money is no object to you and you just want the best performing IEM, like the best technical stuff, then yeah, this would get my recommendation. But that's a cautious recommendation, because at the end of the day, it's not as easy to impact the frequency response. It's not as easy to, EQ stuff with IEMs, because you might be using them in environments where that's just not possible. So you really have to be able to appreciate the tonality that they've gone for here, and I think you can. I think it's not actually that challenging to get into this kind of tonality. It just won't be what you're typically used to. Remember, if anything, this is just subtle coloration. This is not totally out of whack. This is just a different flavor and still calculated, because it doesn't really do anything wrong with its tonality either. So keep that note of caution in mind, but if you do get a chance to try this, definitely do it, because it's at the very least good to know what's possible with IEMs for technical performance. All right, that does it for this review. If you guys like what I'm doing here, consider subscribing. If you don't, that's fine too, but I will see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.